Hi, I'm Pastor Kerry. Hey, before we get started, there are a few things I want to encourage you to have on hand. First, I want to encourage you to have a set of the sermon notes. If you don't already have them, you can go to the link that's right down below the video. It'll take you to a place where you can print a set of the sermon notes for yourself. Also want to encourage you to have some communion elements. You'll want to have some bread or a cracker. You'll want to have some juice or some wine, and if you don't have juice or wine, really any beverage would suffice. But you want to have those communion elements because here in about 20 minutes, when we get to the end of the sermon, we'll move right into a time of communion with you. So, if you need any of those things, then I would encourage you to pause the playback right now. Get whatever you need. Once everything is ready, then go ahead and resume the playback. So I have a question for you. What comes to mind when you hear the word salt? What is the first thing that goes through your head when I say the word salt to you? I know that for myself, when I hear the word salt, the first thing that goes through my mind is yum. Delicious. I love salt. I love salt to a fault. I think that the phrase, "that's too salty," has never come out of my mouth. As far as I'm concerned, the more salt, the better. And I'm sure that you realize, and I do too, that salt is not the best for us, but I can't help it. I absolutely love salt. And it's kind of funny because every once in a while when my wife is doing the grocery shopping, she'll text me and she'll say, "Hey, you're out of the pistachios at home or you're out of the cashews at home. Do you want me to get you some more cashews?" And I'll say, "Yeah, sure." And then she'll say, "Do you want the lightly salted?" And I'll say, "No, absolutely not. Please do not get me anything if it's lightly salted. If it says that on the label, then pass on it. If they're out of the regularly salted, then don't get them. We'll wait until next week. I don't want anything that's slightly salted." And I'll joke there and I'll say, "Do they have heavily salted? Is there extra salt? Do they make my cashews with extra salt? Get those." But the reason that I bring that up today is because salt is going to play an important part in our lectionary gospel reading for this coming Sunday, February 5th of 2023. So, without any further ado, let's go ahead and take a look at that lectionary gospel reading. This is Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 20. If you watched last week's online sermon, we are picking up right exactly where we left off last week. Matthew 5, 13 through 20. Jesus is speaking and he says, "You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything." Amen to that. It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. "You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." May God bless the reading of the inspiring and the challenging word. So these are Jesus' words from the Sermon on the Mount. Last week we talked about the fact that this is the greatest sermon ever preached, the best known sermon ever given. Last week, of course, we focused on the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek, and so on and so forth. That was how Jesus began the Sermon on the Mount last week. This is how he continues the Sermon on the Mount. So let's do what we always do. Let's talk through the passage. Let's make sure that we're tracking with Jesus, because there are some things in here that I think are a little bit challenging to us. And then after we talk through the passage, then we'll focus on 3 of the greatest lessons that this passage has for us. And I will say this right up front, that the lessons are pretty obvious today, but that doesn't make them any less important. So, at the start of the passage, there in the first paragraph, verse 13, Jesus says to the disciples 2,000 years ago, disciples 2,000 years later, Jesus says, "You are the salt of the earth." It says, if you lose your saltiness, how can you be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out. And I want you to think for just a moment about how we use salt in our modern age. Primarily, we use salt as a seasoning. For those of us who live in colder parts of the country, we also use salt to try to dissipate ice. I have spent a fair amount of time over the past several months throwing ice on our driveway and on our sidewalks. There have been lots and lots of big orange vehicles that have been going down our city streets, putting a salt solution down on the roads. But there are many more uses for salt. And one example is that if I want to clean a penny that's gotten tarnished, do you know this? Maybe you already know this and I'm telling you something that you're aware of. But what you do is you just take salt and vinegar and then you just throw a penny into a little dish or a little bowl with salt and vinegar in it, stir it around, and that cleans the penny, almost to the point where it is a bright, brand new looking penny. Did you know that? If not, there's no extra charge for that. A little piece of knowledge. And there are obviously many more ways in which we use salt. And I don't want to get too far off into the weeds, but I do want us to think for just a moment about how salt was used 2,000 years ago, because maybe that's the more important thing for us to consider. 2,000 years ago, there weren't big orange vehicles that drove around the streets of Palestine putting down a salt solution on the roads back then. And I'm pretty sure that back then, I guess I don't know this for a fact, but I'm pretty sure that they didn't use salt and vinegar to clean copper coins back then. I don't know, maybe they did. Maybe I shouldn't be speculating about that. But what's more important is this. Now, did they use salt as a seasoning? Yes. Does the Bible talk about that? Yes. But the Bible also talks about another one of the ways that they used salt 2,000 years ago that we don't particularly use it anymore. Maybe we do to a very small degree, but that is as a preservative. Because think about this. 2,000 years ago, they didn't have refrigeration. And so if you had meat, it went bad pretty fast unless there was a way for you to preserve it. And so they would use salt to preserve meat. There was salted beef 2,000 years ago. There was salted fish 2,000 years ago. And so that is something that they used it for. Something else that you probably haven't thought about, but is talked about in the Bible, is the fact that after a city was destroyed, that they would go and they would salt the earth where that city had been. Now, do you know why they would do that? You know why they would salt the earth after they destroyed a city 2,000 years ago? The reason they would do that is because they didn't want the people who had lived in that city to go back and to rebuild that city. And if they went in and they salted the earth, what would happen is nothing could grow there again. When you have salted the earth, that prevents any vegetation from growing where the soil has been salted. So the Bible talks about that a number of times, how the earth would be salted after a city was destroyed. So 2,000 years ago, it was a preservative. It was also used as a seasoning, but it was also used to prohibit any sort of things from growing. And I want us to, just for a moment, consider the implications of that. Maybe what we should do is maybe we should come back to that actually. Let's come back to that here in a couple minutes. So let's go on to the next paragraph. The next paragraph, verses 14 through 16, Jesus says, "You are the light of the world. A town on a hill can't be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its lampstand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they can see your good deeds and glorify God." We're going to come back and we're going to talk about that again in a few minutes as well. But now, let's move to the final paragraph. Because this one is the paragraph that in my mind, it gets a little bit challenging, particularly at the very end of the paragraph, verses 17 through 20. Now, Jesus starts the paragraph by saying to the people who were listening to him. So, again, this is the Sermon on the Mount, and there was a big crowd that had gathered to hear Jesus that day. And Jesus had to go up on the side of a mountain. Thus, the title of the Sermon on the Mount, because the crowd was so large. He wanted to be able to see everybody, wanted them to be able to see him, wanted them to be able to hear him. So there's a big crowd. There were the capital D disciples, the 12 disciples that were there. But then we can probably refer to all of Jesus' followers back then as his lowercase d disciples, just as I think all of us would consider ourselves today to be his lowercase d disciples. So Jesus says to them, first of all, to everybody who's listening to this sermon that I'm giving right now, I don't want you to think that I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. Now, I know that I've talked to you about this before, but it's okay if you've forgotten. But I just want to ask you this. Whenever you see that 5-word phrase, the law and the prophets, the law and the prophets, you're supposed to think the law and the prophets equals what? The law and the prophets equals what we know as the Old Testament. So Genesis through Malachi, what we know as the Old Testament, that's the law and the prophets. So Jesus is saying, don't think that I've come to abolish the Old Testament. I haven't come to abolish the Old Testament. I've come to fulfill the Old Testament. And again, we know that Jesus, as the Messiah, he did exactly that. He fulfilled all of the prophecies in the Old Testament. And then Jesus goes on to say, until heaven and earth disappear, which obviously Jesus was saying that's a long way away, still a long way away. Jesus is saying until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen by any means will disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Everything is accomplished. Again, that's a long way away. So what Jesus is saying is, those of you who are going to listen to this sermon today, if you think that what I'm about to tell you does away with the teachings of the Old Testament, whether that's the law, whether that's the prophecies of the Old Testament, Jesus was saying to them, and by extension is saying to us, Jesus is saying, I'm telling you you're wrong. I didn't come to do away with any of these things. All of these things are incredibly important. None of them are going to go away. Jesus says, so if anyone thinks that they can set aside any of these teachings from the law and the prophets from the Old Testament, they're going to be in a lot of trouble, is what Jesus says. And I'm sure that he was applying that to himself, and by extension, he was extending that to his followers. And then Jesus says something that is a little bit challenging, maybe even a little bit of a curveball at the very end. In verse 20, Jesus says, I tell you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. And what I want you to think about for a minute is just how careful the Pharisees were 2,000 years ago to follow every single letter of the law. And maybe you've heard other preachers or other Bible study leaders or Sunday school teachers, maybe you've heard them talk about this, maybe you haven't. But one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that the Pharisees were incredibly legalistic and incredibly careful about trying to never break any of the Old Testament commands. Like they were super, super careful to follow every command in the Old Testament, never to break any command in the Old Testament. And that was true of the Pharisees, that was true of the teachers of the law. And they were a little bit extreme about it. So much so that in other places in the Gospels, Jesus was actually very critical of the Pharisees. And that's why when we hear the word Pharisee in this day and age, what we tend to associate with that is the idea of legalism, someone who's totally hung up on following the rules, sometimes to a ridiculous degree. And we know that other places in the Gospels, Jesus was very critical of the Pharisees because he said, you're so hung up on following every single letter of the law that you're forgetting to do the most important thing. You are forgetting to love people. Because to follow this rule, to not break the Sabbath, to follow all of these very, very tangible and very objective rules, well, that was one thing that people could do then. That's something that people can still do today. But what's much more difficult to do, at least in my opinion, and it certainly seems to be implied by what Jesus said to the Pharisees, is that it's much more difficult to follow the subjective laws, like love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus was saying that they didn't. And so, when Jesus says to everybody listening to him, as he gives the Sermon on the Mount, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, I'm sure that some of them went, whoa, because how am I going to do that? These guys live their lives making sure that they never break any single commandment, that they follow every single rule. I'm just a normal person. I'm not a Pharisee. I'm not a teacher of the law. What chance do I have of surpassing their righteousness? And I think that the point that Jesus was trying to make there was that what we need to do is we need to make sure that we're doing our very best to follow the rules. But I think what Jesus was alluding to was the fact that they were failing to follow the most important law of all. And that was to love God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, to love our neighbor as ourselves. So, what I want to do very quickly is I want us to talk now about the 3 lessons that Jesus had for us. And I think that I just inadvertently preached through the 3rd point of this sermon. So maybe what we'll do right now is we'll focus on the first 2. But the first lesson that Jesus had for the disciples 2,000 years ago is this. As disciples, we are called to be salt. As disciples, we are called to be salt. And again, thinking in the context that they used salt 2,000 years ago, was Jesus saying to them that they needed to be the seasoning of the world, that their flavor, that needed to touch all of the culture around them. Is that what Jesus meant? Yeah, probably so. Was Jesus saying to them that they needed to be the preservatives and that, people, that their souls were in great jeopardy? And if Jesus' followers could help the others whose souls were in jeopardy, that they could save their souls, that they could preserve their souls by leading them to the eternal truths? Was that what Jesus was talking about? Yeah, probably so. Was Jesus saying to them, look, there are some bad things that are happening in the world around us, and when those things are maybe initially knocked down, you need to be the ones that go in and you salt the earth so that those things will never grow back? Was that what Jesus was talking about? Quite possibly. You know what? I think it's no mistake that Jesus doesn't spell it out for them there in verse 13, because I think all of those things could apply. I mean, if I really wanted to, I could talk about how Jesus could be talking about the orange trucks that salt the roads before there's ice or snow. I mean, the point is that this is a very open-ended analogy, and it's a beautiful analogy in that sense. And so we are indeed to be the salt of the world. Just like the disciples 2,000 years ago, we still are today. So that is the first lesson. The second lesson is, disciples, we are called to be light. And friends, what did Jesus mean by that? Well, Jesus actually did kind of spell that out for the disciples there in the second paragraph. He said we needed to let our light shine before others so that they could see the good things that we're doing. Not because we're trying to do good deeds to work our way into heaven, but rather people needed to see the good things we do as a result of the love that we have for God, and that they will honor God as a result of the good things that we do. And so, friends, in that sense, we are supposed to be the light. We've talked before about how it was a dangerous world that they lived in 2,000 years ago before the advent of electricity, and that when it got dark outside, it was really dark. And light was the thing that provided safety, provided illumination. And I could tell you stories right now, but I'm running out of time, and so I'm going to go ahead and skip those stories. But we need to do exactly what Jesus asked us to do, and we need to provide light to the world. And finally, as disciples, we are called to be righteous. And as I said before, I kind of accidentally preached this point when I got to the end of the explanation of the passage. So I apologize that I'm doing this a little bit backwards at this point. But again, I would just reiterate, do you and I have a chance of being more perfect as far as following all the rules are concerned than the Pharisees and the teachers of the law 2,000 years ago? No, I don't even have a chance, and I'm a pastor. But the point that I think is more important is the point that Jesus made about the Pharisees later on. And he said, yeah, you follow all the rules, but you don't follow the most important ones. Your love has grown cold. And what we need to do is make sure that we love God and love our neighbor. And is that something that you and I can work on, and hopefully we can try to do as well as them? Well, yeah, hopefully so. So, what I want to do right now is I want to move into our time of communion. And I want to share with you the words of Jesus recorded in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 by the Apostle Paul. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." So right now, I want to encourage you to grab your communion elements, and I'll go ahead and grab mine. And friends, at this time, I'm going to invite you to partake with me. The body of Christ, broken for us. We partake in remembrance of him. And the blood of Christ, shed for us, we drink in remembrance of him. Let us pray. God, we thank you for the Sermon on the Mount. We thank you for the way that guides our lives every day. God, I pray that you would help me and that you would help all of us to be the salt, to be the light that Jesus called us to be, and help us to strive in our righteousness to perhaps even exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. Help us to love you with all our heart, soul,